Hi, my name's Ellery, and last week I found out my son had his engagement dinner without me. They told me the next day, like it was no big deal, like I didn't matter. But that wasn't the worst part. The real pain? It started long before the dinner. Quiet betrayals, a forged will, my wife's letter that wasn't hers, my best friend hiding lies in bourbon glasses. They didn't just forget me, they erased me from my own family. So now I ask you, what kind of son looks you in the eye and lies with a smile? I had the light jacket laid out since morning. One of those gray cotton ones with corduroy elbows that Avira always said made me look like a professor. The afternoon air had that sharp Pennsylvania edge to it, the kind that whispers that summer's over whether you're ready or not. I made myself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and settled into my recliner. At 2:12 p.m., I picked up the phone and dialed my son. "Hey, Joran," I said, my tone light. "What time should I head over for the engagement dinner?" There was a pause, long enough for a sliver of dread to find its way in. "Oh, we had it yesterday. Dad." For a moment, I didn't respond. The line didn't drop, but it might as well have. I sat there blinking at the window, watching a squirrel bury something in the yellowing lawn. "I thought it was today," I finally said. "I sent out a text like, a few weeks ago. Maybe you got the date mixed up." "No, I remember. You said Sunday the 12th, I replied, keeping my voice steady. "That's today." "Huh," he said. "Well, it was kind of last minute anyway. You know how Malis gets with organizing things. Sorry, Dad." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded distracted, like I had interrupted something more important. I ended the call politely. No raised voice. Just a quiet, "All right, take care." And then I sat there with the phone in my lap and a silence so thick it felt like insulation. There's a moment when silence is louder than any shout. The last time I saw everyone together was a barbecue in early summer. Joran had burned the burgers. Avira picked off all the onions like always, and Malis barely looked up from her phone. She cut me off mid-story about a jazz concert I'd taken Joran to as a kid. Said, "We've heard this one, Ellery," without even smiling. I remember that day more clearly now, the way Malis rolled her eyes every time I tried to connect. Joran looked tired then, distant. Avira, sweet girl, gave me this small look, like she knew something wasn't right but didn't know how to fix it. I had brought a handcrafted wooden box I'd carved for Avira's graduation. Malis had taken it from her and set it on the kitchen counter like it was clutter. Avira never even got to open it in front of me. People don't erase you all at once. They start by talking over your sentences. I leaned back into the chair and stared at the ceiling. Something didn't add up. There were no pictures online. None of the usual family spam on Facebook. Not a single message from anyone saying they missed me or asked where I was. Nothing. This wasn't a mix-up. I pulled out the old text Joran had sent me. It read, "Hey, just a heads up. We're doing a dinner for the engagement. Sunday the 12th. Hope you can make it." Vague enough that if you wanted to shift the day and claim misunderstanding, you could. That's when I began to see it. This hadn't started today. This was just the culmination. The missed birthdays, the sudden changes in plans, the holidays where I got the maybe next year call. You don't get excluded overnight. It happens like rust, quietly. Then suddenly, I remembered a talk with Harlan Vexley years ago. We were sipping whiskey after poker night. "Ellery," he said, leaning in, "that woman your son married, she's got a plan, and you're not in it." I had laughed it off then. But now, his words echoed like a forecast I'd ignored. Malis ran the show. She managed the family calendar, coordinated the invites, filtered what Joran saw and heard. Since she came into the picture, Joran's calls shortened, and his tone hardened. Even Avira, once my weekend companion, now texted less, always busy with school. Once, Malis told me flat out during a Thanksgiving cleanup, "Men like you need to know when to let go." I didn't let go. I was pushed. I opened my old email chain, found a few forgot to loop you in messages about family get-togethers I was conveniently excluded from. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore now. I drove out as the sun was beginning to dip low. The trees were all fire-colored, crimson, gold, rust. I parked near Holloway Park, the one with the duck pond and the crooked swing set. I used to bring Joran here when he was Avira's age. We'd feed the geese and skip stones. A man about my age was holding the back of his daughter's seat as she wobbled on a pink bike. She squealed with joy as she took off, and he jogged after her, laughing. That ache in my chest wasn't new. It was just louder today. When had I stopped being part of the story? A man doesn't disappear from his family. He gets archived. Dinner was a quiet affair. Reheated soup and 2 slices of rye bread. I chewed slowly, not tasting a thing. Then I got up, went to the den, and pulled out a worn leather notebook. I began jotting down dates, names, incidents, little slights that had once felt like isolated missteps now stacked like evidence. This was no accident. This was a campaign. I wasn't going to confront them, not yet. If they want to treat me like a relic, they'll regret forgetting how sharp relics can be. They thought I wouldn't notice, but now, I'll make sure they never forget. I woke before the sun. The house so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I sat up in bed, the cold air biting at my arms. Pennsylvania mornings in late autumn don't wait for anyone. I wrapped my robe tight and shuffled to the kitchen. The kettle hissed as I filled it, steam curling like breath I didn't want to release. My hand reached for the chipped mug, white with fading blue letters, Number 1 Dad. The crack near the handle had deepened since last winter. I almost didn't notice it. Kind of like how no one noticed I wasn't at the dinner last night, coffee in hand. I stood by the window, watching the branches sway under a gray sky. I didn't want to turn on the TV. Not really. But I did anyway. Some game show host shouted at contestants while prizes flashed across the screen. None of it stuck. The noise only made the silence louder. I checked my phone. Still nothing. No text. No missed call. Not even one damn emoji from Joran. It hit me. Not one person had even acknowledged my absence. Not a "we missed you." Not a "sorry about the mix-up." I wasn't forgotten. I was removed. There's a moment in a man's life when it's no longer about what was said, but about what was deliberately left unsaid. I was still staring at the screen when the knock came. 3 quick taps. I froze. Then opened the door. Avira stood there, clutching a Tupperware container. She looked up, uncertain. "Hi, Grandpa?" Her coat was too thin for the weather. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She looked like she hadn't slept much either. I brought some cookies. From the engagement party," she said, holding them out. "I thought you might like some." I took them without speaking, then stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." We sat at the kitchen table. She watched her fingers trace circles on the plastic lid. "They're Maylise's recipe," she said. "But I made them," I smiled. "Then they're probably edible." She gave a small laugh. Then silence. After a moment, she said, "Grandma told me you didn't want to come." I blinked. "Did I say that to you?" "No." "You think I'd skip my own son's engagement dinner?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "I know it's not the same, but this was last night." She showed me the photo. They were all there. Joran, Malis, Drex, Harlan, even folks I hadn't seen in years, all smiling in front of a gold and cream congratulations banner, champagne in hand, teeth bared in carefully arranged delight. At the edge of the group, a chair sat empty, barely noticeable, but there. "We saved you a seat," she said, softly. I stared. Not one face looked like they were waiting for someone to fill it. That chair wasn't a space. They needed a prop. My absence had been written into the script. It was staged joy, a curated image. And I was the ghost in the background, unmentioned, unnecessary. Later that day, the phone rang. I expected Joran, but it was Malis. "Ellery," she said, her tone like a receptionist who didn't quite care if you stayed on the line. "I assumed you understood you weren't invited." I paused. "I see." Joran just didn't want any awkward energy. We needed a peaceful evening. I thought that was clear. Her voice was calm, professional, dispassionate. Cruelty's more dangerous when it comes in a calm tone and pretty words. "Well," I said, "thank you for the clarity. I hope there are no hard feelings," she said. Sweet as spoiled tea. I didn't hang up. I just let the silence stretch until she finally clicked off. I went to the attic, pulled out the old wooden storage box. Inside, papers, deeds, letters from Lillian, the love of my life, and the only woman who never made me feel replaceable. My fingers brushed a thick envelope. Unopened. Her handwriting on the front. I set it aside. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out the deed. My name. Still there. Still the one who paid every tax, fixed every pipe, painted every wall. They've forgotten who built this house. I laced up my walking shoes and went outside. People waved as I passed. Neighbors nodded. Old Mrs. Crandall even said, "Still walking like clockwork. Ellery." I smiled at her. They remembered. The wind picked up, and leaves scattered across the sidewalk like little reminders. Time moves, but roots don't lie. I thought of Joran, sitting beside Melis, smiling for the camera. I thought of how many years I'd worked double shifts, passed on vacations, paid off his student loans. Now I was a risk to their ambiance. I returned home and opened my notebook. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote, "Who I was, who they think I am, who I will become." Then I underlined the last sentence twice. If they thought leaving me out was the end of the story, they've clearly forgotten who wrote the first chapter. The attic stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step echoing like a slow drumbeat in the silence of the house. I hadn't been up there in years. Dust hung in the air like a quiet accusation, clinging to the rafters and settling on every forgotten box, like time itself had stalled and waited for me to catch up. The scent of mothballs and old cedar filled my lungs, grounding me in the memory of every holiday decoration, every toy Avira had once begged me not to throw away. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. At least, that's what I told myself. I said I was just organizing, just taking stock. But the truth was, after that photo and Melis's venom wrapped in civility, I needed something more than coffee and silence to hold on to. My eyes fell on a box near the far corner. Faded masking tape held the lid in place, and on the side, in familiar cursive I hadn't seen in too long, it read, "Margot, private." My breath caught. I knelt, brushed off a thick layer of dust, and paused, my hand resting flat on the cardboard. This wasn't the day I planned to open it. But then again, nothing lately had gone according to plan. Inside, the smell shifted, lavender, faint but stubborn, clinging to the fabric of old letters and photographs. Our wedding picture lay on top, slightly bent at the edges. A dried flower from our honeymoon was tucked between two yellowing recipe cards. Then I found it. A single envelope. It had no address, no seal, just my name on the front. The date in the corner, 5 months before Margot died. I opened it slowly. Her handwriting was steady, almost formal. "Elle, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say everything I should have said out loud." I sat on the attic floor and let her voice guide me, her words soaking into a silence that had gone too long without her. "You've always given too much benefit of the doubt. I love that about you, but I worry it's also how someone like Melis gets a foothold." I stopped reading and stared into the dim rafters. I overheard her talking to someone, an advisor. She asked what would happen if you were unwell, not when... if... That scared me. "Elle, she's smiling at you with a plan behind her teeth. If anything happens to me, don't let her charm talk you into silence." My hands were shaking now, not from fear but recognition. Margot had seen what I refused to. And even after all this time, she was still trying to protect me. The memory came back like lightning, 6 months before her death, at a family dinner. The kind where the roast always turned out dry and no one dared say it. She had pulled me aside while Joran and Drex argued over fantasy football. "I know what you're going to say," she began, "but just watch Melis." "She's trying to help," I had said, cutting her off too quickly. Margot didn't argue. She only looked at me, her eyes calm but fierce. "Not everyone who calls you Dad loves you." I had chosen peace over confrontation that night, and now, peace felt like betrayal. back downstairs. I walked the rooms Margot had filled with meaning. Her books still lined the hallway shelves. Her handwriting still labeled jars in the pantry. I stood in the living room and said aloud, I was married to truth. My son married convenience. Then I picked up the phone and called the only person I could trust, Ophelie. I need to review something, I told her, quietly. She didn't ask what or why, just said, I'll be there tomorrow morning. That's why I trust her. That night, I took out Margot's old file folders, trusts, deeds, tax filings. In one of them, I found a clause in her will, written in her own words. Ellery shall remain sole executor of all decisions pertaining to our estate. No mention of Melis. I remembered, after Margot passed, how Melis had insisted on helping organize things, said she wanted to relieve Jorn's burden. At the time, it had sounded generous. Now it reeked of premeditation. Margot, I whispered, gripping the folder. I should have listened sooner. Then I found something else, a CD backup I hadn't seen in years. My fingers fumbled through the drawer until I dug out an old portable player. Static, then clarity, her voice. Happy birthday, Elle. You've still got the strongest spine I know. Don't ever trade it for comfort. The message ended. The silence after felt sacred. I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Began drafting a letter to Joran, not to send, but to prepare. A list of everything I would now protect. My wife's legacy, my name, the truth. If they thought the past was buried, they forgot who dug the ground in the first place. You may have rewritten the guest list. Melis, I muttered, folding the paper in half. But Margot left me the script. Joran's text arrived just before noon on Friday. Come by Sunday. Melis made brunch. Avira wants to see you. Short, polite, no punctuation at the end, as if each word were tiptoeing past something louder. I stared at it for a long minute before replying. I'll be there, not because of Melis, and not because of Joran, but because when your granddaughter asks to see you, you show up. Sunday came quiet. I shaved closer than usual, pressed a blazer I hadn't worn since Margot's memorial, and polished the shoes I used to wear to court. The mirror reflected a man older, sure, but not yet gone. I took Margot's photo album from the bookshelf, the one with her handwriting along the spine, and slipped it into a canvas bag. Their house was tucked into one of those tidy Westchester neighborhoods, uniform hedges, pressure-washed stone, no kids' bikes in the yard. It always struck me how sterile it felt, a home curated for appearances, not stories. Melis opened the door with a practiced smile. Ellery, lovely to see you. Her voice was butter over ice. Melis? I nodded, not offering a hug. Joran appeared behind her. He gave me a one-armed side hug, already turning away as he mumbled, Thanks for coming. Then came Avira, that child. She wrapped her arms around me like it still meant something. Her hand slipped into mine under the dining table as I sat down. Quiet solidarity. The brunch table was laid like a photo shoot, everything symmetrical, matching napkin rings and all. Melis poured mimosas with a hum. You know, she said, glancing at my open collar. That shade of blue was always Margot's favorite. A bit outdated, but charming. I smiled without teeth. Some things age well. Joran barely looked up from his phone. Avira sat stiffly beside me, her food untouched. I set the album between us and opened it. This was our honeymoon. Margot insisted we backpack the whole coast. She got lost twice, but never admitted it. Silence. Not even a chuckle from Joran. I turned the page. She hated secrets. Said they stole more than they protected. That a family built on silence is already halfway buried. Melis's knife paused mid-slice. Joran finally looked up. Dad, he sighed. This isn't the time. Then tell me, I asked. When is the time to talk about your mother? When does legacy start to matter again? Joran rubbed his temples. We're just trying to live, Dad. Not everything's a conspiracy. No, I said. But some things are orchestrated. He pushed back from the table. We're not doing this. I reached into my blazer and slid a copy of Margot's original trust clause across the table. You should read this. Again. Melis reached for it, but I placed my hand gently over hers. It's not for you. She smiled thinly. You've always been dramatic, Ellery, and you've always underestimated what I remember, I replied. Joran stood. We're not fighting over paperwork today. No, I said evenly. We're not. But you'll remember this conversation the next time someone tells you it's just paperwork. Avira didn't speak, but her grip on my wrist tightened under the table. As we walked out to my car, she finally spoke. Did Grandma really leave a letter? She asked. She did. She looked down. Malis asked me to sign something last week. Said it was just technical stuff. Said you'd want me to. I stopped walking. Avira, listen to me. Never sign anything you don't understand. You are not a background player in this. Your voice matters. I'm with you. Grandpa, she whispered. I just don't know how to fight her. You don't have to, I said. You just have to stand still. That alone disrupts her plans. Back home, I filed away the brunch, literally. Malis's remarks, Joran's tone, Avira's hesitation. They went into a folder titled Leverage. Then I picked up the phone and called Ophelie. We need to move our meeting up. Monday, if you can. She didn't ask why. That's what makes her different. I sat at my desk, wrote down 3 sentences. Joran is too blind, or too comfortable. Avira is scared, but she's not sleeping. Malis stopped hiding. That's her mistake. They think I'm just the old man in the corner, forgotten with the furniture. But I built this house. I know every nail, every beam, and I never stopped keeping records. That was me being polite. What comes next? They'll wish they'd kept inviting me to every damn dinner. They say still water runs deep. Well, mine just started to ripple. The text from Joran came late Friday evening. I was finishing my second cup of black coffee, staring at the old typewriter on the bookshelf like it still owed me a decent sentence. His message read, We're heading up to the cabin this weekend. Final look before it goes on the market. Thought you might want to see it one last time. One last time. I hadn't agreed to selling the cabin. No conversation, no family vote, not even a courtesy call. Just a quiet assumption that my silence meant approval. That's what Malis always counted on. People too tired or too polite to push back. I stared at the message for a good 5 minutes before replying, I'll be there. Not to reminisce, to investigate. The drive to Lake Wallenpaupack took just under 2 hours. I didn't play the radio. I let the quiet fill the space. But my mind wasn't quiet. I packed light, some clothes, Margot's old letters, and a copy of her handwritten note, the one they kept dismissing as sentiment. I saw it as a declaration. Pulling into the gravel driveway, I felt the crackle of familiarity, the tilt of the porch, the swing half-rusted at the edge of the deck. Margot planted daisies there every spring. I half expected to see her kneeling in the dirt, gloves on, humming something off-key. But the house looked like it was already halfway out of our lives. There were stickers on furniture, colored tags, some scribbled with numbers. Boxes sat stacked along the hallway marked Auction House and Donate. A photo of Joran in high school football gear leaned sideways on a shelf, like even it wasn't sure if it belonged. I walked from room to room, saying nothing, just looking, remembering. Margot's recipe box was missing. The rocking chair was wrapped in plastic. I found Avira's baby blanket shoved in a bin marked Misk Soft Items. That's when I clenched my fists, not out of rage, but resolve. I stepped out to the back deck, the wooden boards creaking like they were warning me. Malis was there, clipboard in hand, talking numbers to someone on the phone. She gave me a cursory glance. Ellery, glad you could make it. I nodded. Didn't realize I was late to the funeral. Lunch was a scattered affair on paper plates. Joran talked logistics. Malis kept steering the conversation toward timelines, contractors, closing costs. I let them ramble until my fork hit the plate one last time. Funny, I said, dabbing my mouth with a napkin. I don't recall signing off on any sale. Malis didn't flinch. Your signature isn't needed anymore. Joran holds trustee rights on this asset. Joran chimed in, trying to sound reasonable. Dad, it's just practical. You barely come up here. It's too much upkeep. I placed my glass on the table, not slammed, just firm. This place was her heart. You don't trade that in like a used car. Silence. Then, Malis smiled, that polished smile she saves for realtors and tax attorneys, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. Later, I stood by the dock when Drex joined me. His steps were hesitant, shoulders tight. He didn't speak right away, just stared at the water. "She's pushing this sale hard," he said. "Got her lawyer looking at the trust language, finding wiggle room through Joran's rights." I kept my gaze steady. "And you?" He shifted. "She paid me to stay quiet. Not much. Just enough to make me hesitate." I waited. He exhaled. "I couldn't sit with it. You deserve to know before it's all gone." I nodded slowly. "You've got one shot to choose who you really are in this family. Drex, make it count." That night, the fire crackled inside the cabin's stone hearth. It was the kind of fire Margot used to poke at with her bare hands, claiming the tools just got in the way. I placed a framed photo in the middle of the coffee table, Margot holding newborn Avira under that very tree out back. "This house wasn't just timber and nails," I said. "It was a promise." Joran looked uncomfortable. "She didn't leave a formal will about the cabin, Dad." I slid the handwritten note across the table. She wrote, "Keep this cabin for Avira. Let her choose what it becomes." Malis leaned forward. "That's not legally binding." I leaned back. "Maybe not in court, but in this family, it binds." Avira had walked in midway through. She stood there, watching us, holding something wrapped in old newspaper. Her eyes met mine. "You brought the photo," she said quietly. I nodded. Malis stiffened. Joran said nothing. The fire popped, sending a spark skyward. "You can sell every plate in this place," I said, voice steady. "But you don't touch these walls without going through me." The room held its breath. Avira took a step closer. "This place. It's where I remember her laughing." Joran swallowed hard. "Dad," I didn't let him finish. "One day, this might have been your daughter's treehouse." Silence. They had no words. But I'd found mine again. The envelope didn't have a return address. No stamp either, just dropped in my mailbox like a silent warning. It was thin, the kind of weightless that fools you until you open it. Inside were photocopies of trust documents I'd never laid eyes on before. Different fonts, newer notary stamps, signatures I didn't recognize. My own name, once printed clean under primary trustee, had been moved down to advisor. That single shift changed everything. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning light crawling across the wood grain like it was trying to warn me too. Someone had tampered with what was left of Margot's intentions. And not subtly, either. This was calculated, precise, quiet, just like Malis liked things. I thought of Drex, his stammer at the lake, his eyes darting like a child caught in someone else's lie. Maybe he'd had a hand in this, or maybe he was the leak. I slid the envelope back into my coat pocket, grabbed my keys, and drove downtown. If there was one person I trusted to read between the lines, it was Ophelie. She didn't flinch when I laid the documents on her desk, but her hands moved fast, flipping pages, cross-referencing dates on her laptop, pulling files from the cabinet behind her. "These aren't just amendments, Ellery. These are architectural overhauls." I watched her red pen move with surgical sharpness, circling, annotating, tapping the margins. "Here, this trustee clause. Yours used to say sole authority. Now it reads consulting party. That's a complete restructuring." She pointed to a signature. "That's dated March 5th. You told me you were hospitalized then." "I was. Pneumonia." My voice cracked before I caught it. "I never signed anything in that hospital bed. I could barely lift a fork." Her brow tightened. "Then this could qualify as forgery. And if we prove it was used to redirect assets, it's more than a civil issue." She told me to sit tight. No confrontations yet. She'd begin a silent audit. Track changes through legal records. Build quietly until we could strike loud. I nodded, but part of me already burned to confront them. That heat needed somewhere to go. That heat found its outlet 2 days later. By accident. I'd gone out to pick up a new garden hose, nothing more. But when I returned and stepped into the driveway, I heard voices. Joran's car was still running. The driver's door was open, phone on Bluetooth, Malis's voice pouring through the speaker like a cracked radio. She wasn't whispering. She never whispers when she thinks she owns the room. We'll push the assets through the Nevada LLC next week, before the judge gets wind. He's too old to trace half this stuff anyway. He'll tire out before he connects the dots. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, the plastic bag in my hand stretching under its own weight. I reached into my pocket, grabbed my phone, and snapped a picture of the car's screen, call log, timestamp, contact name. I turned off the engine and walked back into the house without a word, but the silence wasn't surrender. That night, I spread everything on the table, trust papers, the photo of the car log, Margot's letter, the folder Ophelie gave me. Then I grabbed my old recorder, the one I used to keep meeting minutes with when I ran the small business committee downtown. I pressed play, let it buzz out old static, and smiled. Still worked. I wrote down every detail I remembered, every timeline, every inconsistency. When I looked up, the house felt heavier than it had in years, but not because of grief. This was resolve. They wanted me fatigued. They counted on my silence, but I had learned one thing from years in the shadows of loss. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. The next morning, I sat across from Ophelie again. "You brought a whole case file," she said, almost impressed. "I've been underestimated before." She looked through my notes, read the transcripts, paused at the call log photo. "This is compelling. If we can get Drex to corroborate, it builds a timeline the judge can't ignore. Drex's conscience is cracking. We just need to wedge it open. We'll draft for mediation first, keep them from scrambling assets any further." As I stood to leave, she tapped the folder. "You're not just fighting for property, Ellery. This is about rewriting a legacy." I nodded. "And I'm not done writing." The night before the mediation, I sat alone at the kitchen table, papers spread like a disassembled map of my own life. There was no wine, no music, just the low hum of the fridge and the ache behind my right eye that always came with too much reading and too little rest. I wasn't looking for justice anymore. Not really. I just wanted the lying to stop. I flipped through each document with the deliberate precision I used to use tuning the engine of my first truck. The trust edits, the call logs, photos I'd taken. Ophelie said to stay factual, avoid emotion. But there's nothing neutral about betrayal wearing your son's face. I rehearsed what I'd say, calm, controlled. I even practiced aloud, staring at the window's reflection like I was on trial already. Before bed, I reached into Margot's old jewelry box and slipped her brooch into my jacket pocket. She wore it the night we signed our first mortgage. If I needed steel, she'd be it, at sunrise. I drove myself downtown. No driver, no assistance. I wasn't going there to plead. I was going to stop pretending. The law office conference room was pristine, marble floors, abstract paintings, and air too cold for comfort. They called it neutral ground. It felt more like enemy territory. Joran and Melis entered first, dressed like they were about to sell a luxury condo. She wore ivory. He wore that same flat look he used when he lied as a kid. I noticed he couldn't meet my eyes. She didn't bother trying. Drex came in last, head down, taking the seat beside Joran without a word. The mediator, a graying woman with efficient glasses and a tight smile, outlined the agenda like it was just another Tuesday. Asset clarification, emotional closure, path to resolution. She said it like reading ingredients off a cereal box. Melis wasted no time. "We all want to respect Ellery's legacy," she said, syrupy sweet. But emotions cloud reason. I almost choked. She spun the room like a conductor. Joran nodded when she paused. Drex stared at his hands. Ophelie sat to my left, stone-faced. Then came the ambush. Melis produced a flash drive. "If we're talking legacy, we should be transparent." The mediator obliged. The audio filled the room, my voice, unmistakable, saying, "I don't care what happens to the house." My stomach dropped. "That's doctored," Ophelie snapped. "There's no chain of custody. That's a stitched recording, his words cut from different conversations." Melis raised a brow. "Can you prove that?" I stayed quiet, let the silence stretch. Then I leaned forward. "I'm old, not obsolete," I said evenly. You may have edited my words, but you can't edit the man who lived them. We took a break. I headed toward the restroom, but Drex followed at a distance. As I turned down the hallway, he closed the distance and pressed a folded paper into my hand without meeting my gaze. "It's where Joran moved the pension," he muttered, then disappeared. Back in the room, I sat straighter. I passed the paper discreetly to Ophelie. She glanced at it, lips tightening with recognition. After the mediator reconvened, I spoke first. "Let's talk timelines." I laid out the notary inconsistencies. Then, the false edits, the patterns of asset movement. Each piece added another nail. Ophelie's voice followed mine. Legal, sharp, inescapable. The mediator leaned back. "Given what's presented, I'll need to pause this session for review." That's when Joran finally cracked. "None of this was my idea." Melis's head snapped toward him, fury barely concealed. I looked at my son. "Maybe it wasn't, but you never stopped it either." As the room emptied, I remained seated a moment longer. When I left that room, I didn't know who would crack first, Melis, Joran, or the foundation of everything they built on greed. Twilight had settled in like a reluctant guest, turning my study into a pocket of muted gold. The overhead light hummed faintly while I flipped through a stack of court transcripts, pages that had become too familiar, pension withdrawals, trust amendments, timelines, all neat on paper, yet something gnawed beneath them, some missing thread I couldn't quite pull. The air was too still. I could hear the walls breathing. Then, above me, a faint thump. Not loud, not threatening, just enough to rattle a memory loose. The attic. I hadn't gone up there in years. Maybe. Not since Margot passed. I stood, joints stiff, and made my way to the narrow stairs. Each creak underfoot carried a whisper from some earlier version of my life. When I reached the top, I hesitated. Nostalgia is a dangerous drug, especially for the old. You think you're rummaging through boxes, but really, it's yourself you're unpacking. Dust greeted me first, then the quiet, heavy kind that dares you to break it. I navigated past forgotten holiday decorations and yellowing photo frames until I saw the corner chest. A lockbox, deep green with one brass hinge missing. I opened it slowly, careful like I was reaching into the past with bare hands. Inside, tucked between old insurance forms and birthday cards, was a red folder I didn't recognize. "Estate notes," it read, Margot's handwriting. No doubt. I didn't remember seeing this when she passed. I opened it, expecting old account ledgers or her usual neat inventories. Instead, I found an envelope, yellowed and faintly curled at the edges. My hands paused. The script was unmistakable. Joran, it said, dated just 2 months before she died. I unfolded the letter and began reading. Her tone was warm, motherly, but beneath that ran a current of unease. She mentioned being unsure about what Melis suggested, something about changing the deed, and then this: "I think your father deserves to know, but Melis says it'll only upset him." I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding steadily. Margot hadn't mentioned any of this to me, not once. And Joran, he'd read this. He knew. He knew she was confused, doubted what Melis was doing, and said nothing. Beneath that letter was another, still folded, never sealed, addressed to me. The words started softer than I expected, but then came the cracks. "Melis insists the medication changes are for the better," Margot had written, "but I don't feel like myself." She questioned why Drex, of all people, had suddenly started visiting again, always with Melis. Then, right before the last line, her handwriting trembled. "If I forget who I am, remember me for who I was before this summer." I read that part again, and again. My throat tightened. They didn't just deceive her, they erased her. I sat there for what felt like hours, not crying, not shouting, just becoming something else. I folded both letters carefully and slid them into my jacket, and then I saw it. Another document tucked beneath the folder. Legal, stamped, but unsigned. An earlier draft of her will. The line that tore through me was clear. I do not wish for Malus to handle my affairs. Pinned to it was a post-it from Ophelie. Found in archive, wasn't sure it mattered. It mattered now. Everything made sense. The forced signature timing. The sudden silence from Margot in her last weeks. The will we'd been handed. Doctored. Intentional. I picked up my phone. "Ophelie," I said when she answered. "Clear your calendar tomorrow. We're going to open a very quiet war." Later that night, I spread out the documents, scanning each one into a secure drive. My fingers were slow, but steady. Analog truths meeting digital revenge. I jotted down a sequence of events outline, meticulous, surgical. I wasn't acting out of grief anymore. I was moving with clarity. "They thought I was too broken to notice," I murmured, locking the letters into a drawer marked for Avira if something happens to me. That night, I didn't sleep, but I wasn't restless. I was rehearsing, not what I'd say, but what I wouldn't let slide. I arrived 20 minutes early at Ophelie's office. The leather folder under my arm wasn't just filled with paper. It carried the weight of every sleepless night I'd survived since Margot's passing. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with deliberate calm. Ophelie looked up from her desk. "You look focused." "I'm not chasing justice anymore," I said, setting the folder down. I'm correcting history," she nodded. "Everything's ready. The letters are digitized. Your affidavit's signed and notarized. Backup copies are secure in 3 different places." I opened the folder, pulled out a single envelope, and handed it to her. "You know the signal. If they talk first, you listen. If they lie first, you act." She didn't ask what was inside. That's the kind of trust we'd earned. We reviewed the declaration one last time. My name sat at the bottom of the page, followed by a simple line. Intent to challenge the last will of Margot Vaughn on grounds of coercion and undue influence. I signed it without hesitation. Some wars aren't won with fists or fury, just facts. When the clock struck 4, they arrived. Malus came in like she always did, heels sharp, expression sharper. Joran held the door, the facade of civility intact. Drex trailed behind, phone in hand, smug in his silence. Joran started things off, like he'd practiced in front of a mirror. "Dad, we didn't come to fight. We came to heal the family." Ophelie offered a cordial smile. "That's wonderful. Why don't we begin with you telling us, in your own words, why you believe the final will represent Margot's wishes?" Malus spoke first. Because it was her signature, her decision, Ophelie reached into the folder and placed 2 yellowed letters on the table. "Then perhaps you can help us understand why she wrote this just 2 months before she passed." Drex chuckled. "Old people write a lot of things. Doesn't mean they count." She slid a video still across the table, a time-stamped shot of Drex entering Margot's home with a white prescription bag. The date matched the week Margot collapsed. Ophelie's voice remained even. "What was in the bag? Mr. Vaughn?" Drex's jaw twitched. Joran stiffened. Malus folded her arms tighter. That's when I spoke. "You didn't just steal money. You rewrote her final months, and you almost convinced me she faded because of age. But it was your influence that smothered her voice." I turned to Joran. "And you let it happen. You let her doubt herself because it made your inheritance more convenient." Ophelie slid one last document across the table. "This has already been submitted to the court. Today isn't a discussion. It's a courtesy." The room went still. Then Ophelie's phone buzzed. She looked, then handed it to me. A headline blinked on screen. "Daughter-in-law interfered in dying woman's will. Letters reveal." Malus blanched. Drex cursed under his breath. Joran's practiced charm shattered. I stood up. "This isn't vengeance. It's preservation." I left the folder on the table and walked out. My footsteps measured. Steady. Behind me, the silence did the rest. Back home. I poured a glass of bourbon and sat on the porch. The sky was soft orange, like Margot used to paint it on canvas. A neighbor walked by, lifted a hand. I raised mine in return, not smiling, not sad, just leveled. "It's funny," I muttered to no one, "how justice doesn't feel like victory, just peace, tired peace." I opened a notebook and began writing. Avira, one day you'll inherit more than assets. You'll inherit the cost of silence and the price of speaking up. I wrote slowly, deliberately, as the cicadas started their evening chorus. You don't beat family, you survive it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you reclaim your name from their hands. Just then, the mailman passed. I heard the click of the box. When I went to check, only one envelope waited. No return address, no handwriting I recognized. I opened it standing in the doorway. My hand didn't shake, but my jaw did. The envelope didn't belong in my study. It stood out from the rest, not just because it was a thick, yellowed manila envelope, but because it carried a faint, haunting scent of lavender. No return address, no sender's name, just my name typed neatly on a label. And inside, something I wasn't meant to find. Ophelie had dropped it off with a soft knock, setting it on my desk like it might explode. It was buried in the old trust paperwork, misfiled under a tax audit binder. I only caught it because of the paper stock, too heavy. I didn't touch it for an hour. I just sat there, staring at it while the sun crawled across the rug. My fingers hovered over the seal, but something in my gut clenched. When I finally opened it, my hands were slow. The paper inside was fragile, nearly brittle. The handwriting, elegant, slanted, clearly written by a woman. It was addressed to Malis. The name Maribel Greeley, signed in careful loops at the bottom of the page, Maribel. The name rang like a half-remembered hymn. Malis's sister, or so I was told, had died in Europe long ago. But this letter was postmarked 1989, and the ink had not faded. I almost put it away, almost burned it, but curiosity was a cruel and loyal companion. I read it. "Milas," the letter began, "you win. I can't fight you anymore, but I won't be quiet either." Maribel's voice unfolded like poetry, wounded, defiant, and heavy with regret. "You said you'd ruin me if I spoke. You said no one would believe me, but I remember what you did in Nantucket, and I'm tired of carrying it." Each sentence chipped away at the person I thought Malis was. Maribel detailed the manipulation, the calculated seduction of my father, Vincent, the forged psychiatric documents she used to force his hand. My mother's supposed episodes were never confirmed, just pages of fabricated records, just enough to isolate her, just enough to rewrite a legacy. "She loved him," Maribel wrote, "and you made the world believe she was unfit. You always wanted the Vaughn name, Malis. You didn't care how you got it." My chest tightened. Maribel's words were final. "You can bury this letter, but one day, someone will read it and they'll know. I'm not afraid of you anymore." I sat motionless for what felt like hours. The Malis I knew, the one who brought me lemonade on hot afternoons, who sang in the kitchen, who comforted me when my father grew distant, was suddenly two-dimensional. A mask, a role played for my benefit. Every refusal to speak of her past, every time she waved away questions about family, it wasn't grief, it was strategy. My father, his change in the final years, suddenly made sense. The paranoia, the increasing isolation. He wasn't losing his mind, he was being cornered. My entire childhood had been orchestrated around an illusion. I brought the letter to Ophelie the next morning. She read it quietly, then pulled out her laptop without a word. Within 15 minutes, she had confirmed the hospital name mentioned, still operating under a different name. She found a record of a woman admitted under my mother's name, without a diagnosis, no treatment, no follow-up. They held her for 72 hours and discharged her. The notes are vague, no clear reasoning. This smells like a sham admission. Ophelie leaned back. "If we can prove coercion or fraud tied to your father's estate planning, this changes everything." But I wasn't thinking about the court. I was thinking about my mother. Her name had been scrubbed from our family story, replaced with a narrative that suited Malis. That afternoon, I sat on the porch, rereading the letter. Avira came out quietly. She saw it in my hand and frowned. "That's about Grandma Melis, isn't it?" I tried to fold it away. "It's complicated." She took the page from me before I could stop her. "Read it in silence." And then her face collapsed. "She taught me how to braid my hair," Avira whispered. "She was there when I got my braces off. She told me we came from strong women." "She did," I said, unsure if I believed it anymore. Avira didn't cry. She just stood up and said, "If Joran knew about this and didn't say anything." I didn't answer. She shook her head. "I don't know who any of you are anymore." And she walked inside without looking back. I needed someone outside the storm. I drove to Drex's, handed him the letter, and waited. He skimmed it with narrowed eyes, then laughed. Harsh, bitter. "Greeley skeleton. Huh? I always knew something was off. Your dad never looked her in the eye near the end." He tapped the page. "She bribed staff to keep the psych records sealed, didn't she? That's how these women operate. Quiet threats, hidden favors." He leaned in. "Don't think this is over. Letters like this, they don't stay hidden unless someone wants them found." Then he said the line that stuck. "Don't dig unless you're ready to bury what you find." The next day, I met Melis for tea. I needed to see her reaction. "I was just thinking about your sister," I said, calmly. She froze for a second, then smiled. "So, Pandora's box is open." Her voice turned syrupy. "She begged me to destroy that letter, but I let her send it. Let her believe she had some power left." I stared at her. She sipped her tea. "You should be careful, Ellery. Secrets don't just stay buried. Sometimes they dig their way out." And then she added, almost playfully, "You're not the only one who's been keeping things close to the chest." Later that evening, as I stirred the fire, something white fluttered up beneath the logs. I pulled it out, half burnt. My name, written in the same hand as Maribel's. Another letter, one she hadn't sent, one someone didn't want me to see. I stood there, still gripping the charred envelope. My name was scrawled across it in a shaky hand, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges where heat had licked the paper. A faint scent of bourbon clung to it, mixing with the sharpness of soot. This wasn't like Maribel's handwriting. This was too careful, too deliberate. The paper stock was smooth, modern, nothing like the brittle yellowed parchment she'd used. Ophelie walked in just as I laid the envelope on the study table. "That's not from the same era," she said without preamble, eyeing the letter as though it might bite. "Someone wanted you to find this, but not too easily. That's control disguised as mystery. It's manipulation." Her words sat with me as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single slip of paper, typed. No signature, just one sentence. "She was not working alone. Someone close to you still is." It wasn't fear that made my hands tremble. It was rage. Drex came by later that morning. The old man still moved like a retired Marine, precise and deliberate. I handed him the letter. "Fire's not my only specialty," he muttered, squinting at the burns. "But I was a volunteer back in Maine." He held it to the light, rubbed the charred edge gently. "This wasn't some fireplace accident. It was scorched just enough to look dramatic, but not enough to destroy. Whoever did this knew fire, knew you, wanted deniability." I watched him flip the page over. Laser-printed, modern toner, not an old typewriter like that first letter. And you weren't supposed to know who it was from. You were supposed to wonder, doubt, spiral. I started making a list in my head. People who had access to my study. People who'd benefit from chaos. That list was short. My mind returned to Harlan Vexley. He'd had a key, hell. For years he had a room here when we were still pretending to be brothers by choice. After everything that unfolded, the money, the trust, why not this too? Ophelie leaned into my office later, holding a slim folder. "Ellery, Harlan accessed the Vaughn Trust records at the county archive last week, without a formal request." I closed my eyes. Of course he did. She placed the folder gently on my desk. He's digging for something, or hiding it. I grabbed my coat. Where are you going? To see if snakes still smile. Harlan's house hadn't changed. The manicured yard, the polished brass knocker, same performative charm as ever. He greeted me like I was just dropping in for scotch and old stories. Well, you look like hell, he said with that damn smirk. Drink? Bourbon, I replied. Neat. We sat. He poured. He smiled too easily. I watched his hands, steady, smooth. You ever think about Vincent lately? He asked, leaning back. The man had grit. Yeah, I said. He also had people around him who made sure he died isolated and paranoid. His brow twitched. I sipped my drink. You remember Maribel Greeley? A pause. Just a flicker. I met her once? He said. Didn't leave much of an impression. You're a good liar, Harlan, but not that good. He looked at me long, then sighed. We all did what we had to do to protect the legacy. Legacy. That word again. I stood, left the drink untouched. No more words needed. Back home. Avira waited for me with her laptop open. I ran the font on the second letter, she said, not looking up. Matched it to an old email from Harlan. Ophelie chimed in from across the room, holding a printout. Spacing, margins, alignment. It's a match. Avira's voice cracked. He's still trying to protect her, even now. I didn't answer. I just nodded and walked to my desk. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, clicked my fountain pen open, and began drafting a new will. No lawyers. No intermediaries, just me and ink. Trust isn't inherited, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. It's carved out, betrayal by betrayal. Later that evening, Drex returned, face tight with urgency. I traced something, he said, pulling out a folded bank statement. Harlan and Malis had a joint account, buried under a dummy LLC. He laid out withdrawal slips, big ones, just after Vincent's death, right before the trust amendment. And get this, Harlan bought an industrial shredder the week Malis died, delivered to a cabin near Lake Cochrane. They'd been planning something, or someone. Maybe my father figured it out too late. Maybe that's why he grew so cold those last few months. Drex's warning was a rasp. He's not done yet. Neither is this story. Just before midnight, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went back to the half-burned letter. Something inside felt uneven. I slit the back seam and pressed gently. A tiny flash drive, black, no label, fell into my hand. Ophelie scanned it in silence. One document, one audio file. The document, an affidavit, sworn by Maribel, accusing both Malis and Harlan of conspiring to manipulate the family trust. The audio file, a recording. Harlan and Malis, planning, laughing, calculating. Malis's voice, clear as day. If Ellery ever finds this, make sure he blames me. He can't handle the truth about Harlan. I sat still. She was right. But not anymore. I didn't call it a trap when I sent the invitations. Just dinner. One final supper, under the illusion of reconciliation. I chose my father's old dining hall. Had the staff set the table just like he used to, long white linen, silver flatware polished to a mirror shine, and his favorite crystal glasses at each place setting. The chandelier was dimmed just enough to glow like a halo above us. Formal. Old money Southern. Malis would have approved, which made it perfect. Joran arrived first. His steps were stiff, eyes darting around like he wasn't sure if he should sit or flee. Avira followed silently, clutching a notepad like armor. Drex stood by the window, arms folded, jaw locked. Ophelie came last, calm, measured, a slim briefcase in hand. And then Harlan strolled in, 10 minutes late, drenched in arrogance. He wore the same cologne my father despised and brought a bottle of bourbon like it was a gift. I smiled as I poured wine. To endings, I said, raising my glass, and clean tables. Beneath the table, a small device clicked on. I'd tested the live stream feed twice. It was private, encrypted, but very real. So was the second recorder in Ophelie's case. Every word tonight would matter. I didn't waste time. "I'd like to share something," I said, unfolding the affidavit. "A letter Maribel never filed. It explains how Malus and Harlan worked together to rewrite the trust." I handed each guest a printed copy. Harlan didn't even glance at his "dead women tell convenient tales," he said, smirking. "You sure this isn't your grief talking?" Ophelie responded coolly. "Bank statements don't grieve, nor do shredders purchased on March 3rd, coinciding with the first draft of the forged will." She placed the receipt in front of him. Harlan's nostrils flared. Joran scanned the transcript, color draining from his face. "You told me she was preserving the family legacy," he muttered. I locked eyes with him. "She was preserving control. At your expense. And mine." I slid one final page to Drex. "Read this aloud." It was a memo from our father, handwritten weeks before his death. In it, he expressed grave doubts about Malus's intentions and mentioned missing financial documents. The room went silent. Harlan gave a nervous chuckle. "Your old man was slipping." "Enough," I said, standing. "You didn't just rob me. You stole from a man dying of cancer," he sneered. "Proof? You mean like how you knew the typeface on the forged letter before anyone showed it to you?" I asked, watching his lips twitch. He backpedaled, sputtered. Ophelie gave a subtle nod. We had what we needed. The live stream caught every tell. Avira raised her phone. Smile. "Harlan, this is going to the cloud." I leaned in, firm and deliberate. "That forged will, null. And the inheritance? It's being redirected. Permanently." Harlan's veneer cracked. "You think this'll stick? You'll drag this family through hell?" "You already did," Avira said, voice steady. "We're just cleaning up." He stood, rattled. "You'll regret this." "Not as much as you'll regret ignoring the blinking red light under the table," I replied, nodding at the recorder. He stormed out. Avira hit send. I poured the rest of my wine and sat down again. Slowly. The next morning, Ophelie filed the injunctions. Accounts were frozen before Harlan could move a dime. A courier delivered a sealed packet to the district attorney. Audio recordings, timelines, financial trails, forged documents, the works. By afternoon, the press had it. Prominent legal advisor implicated in multi-million-dollar family trust fraud. Malus's carefully curated legacy crumbled within hours. I imagined her scowling from beyond. That evening, Drex and I drove out to the cemetery. We said little. The sun had just dipped behind the tree line. He knelt by Dad's grave, placed a plaque beside the headstone. The truth always finds daylight. 3 days later, Joran showed up. Alone. No suit. No entourage. Just a man fraying at the edges. "I didn't know," he said. I nodded slowly. "You didn't ask." He lowered his gaze. "She turned me against you. Gradually." "I thought she was protecting me." "Protection without truth is manipulation." His voice cracked. "Is there anything left of my inheritance?" I didn't flinch. "There is, but not for free. You want to carry the Vaughn name. You'll earn it. Start by telling the truth, publicly." He nodded. For once, he didn't argue. Later that week, Avira returned with an envelope, full scholarship confirmation. She didn't say much, just held it up like a badge of honor. I sat her down in the study, handed her the revised will. "You're the trustee now," I told her. "And Drex is your co-signer." She blinked fast. "You didn't have to." "That's exactly why I did." We sat by the lake as the sun dipped low. I gave her the deed. Her hands trembled, but her spine stayed straight. That night, I returned to the dining hall. The table was empty, echoing. One chair remained pulled out, Malus's. I stared at it, not with hate, just finality. A letter sat beside my plate. From Ophelie. Trial date confirmed. Harlan would face a jury. I poured a final glass of wine and settled into my father's old seat. "We bury the dead," I whispered. "We don't bury their lies."